At first light on the 14th of November 1965, the Ia Drang Valley in the Central Highlands was still blanketed in mist. Suddenly, the roar of helicopter engines ripped through the silence. Dozens of American Hu-1A Hueys skimmed low over the treetops, then descended one after another onto the open clearing known as X-Ray at the foot of the Chu Prong mountain range. For the soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment jumping off the helicopters, this was the first time they would come face-to-face with North Vietnamese main force troops on the battlefield. None of them realized they were about to step into one of the fiercest battles of the war, a fight that would rage for 4 days and nights. And none of them knew that, in this seemingly desolate land, North Vietnamese forces had already set a deadly trap and were waiting. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, the United States officially expanded its military involvement in Vietnam. By early 1965, American combat units began to be deployed directly onto the South Vietnamese battlefield. Washington's prevailing strategy at this stage was to exploit technological superiority and mobility to seek out and destroy the enemy's main force units, forcing them into direct, large-scale engagements in which superior firepower could be brought to bear effectively. To confront an opponent that was both numerous and combat experienced, the U.S. side mobilized its advantages in firepower and mobility to the fullest extent. The 3rd Air Cavalry Brigade committed a total of 3 infantry battalions, roughly over 1,200 troops to the Ia Drang battlefield, supported by 2 artillery battalions, 24 105mm howitzers, with approximately 1,000 artillerymen. During each day of fighting, U.S. artillery fired up to 6,000 rounds. Tactical air forces flew hundreds of bombing and rocket strike sorties. Most notably, for the first time, B-52 strategic bombers were employed in a tactical carpet bombing role, with a total of 96 sorties, dropping approximately 5,000 tons of bombs over several days. U.S. forces used more than 100 helicopters for troop insertion, resupply, and medical evacuation, making this the first battle fought on a large scale under their helicopter air mobility doctrine. In contrast, North Vietnamese forces consisted primarily of regular infantry equipped with light weapons, AK-47 rifles, machine guns, 82mm mortars, and recoilless rifles. With approximately 1,500 troops directly engaged at Ia Drang. Although lacking heavy weapons and air support, North Vietnamese units gained a critical advantage by achieving local numerical superiority at points of contact through careful selection of terrain and timing. Their approach emphasized close-quarters combat, grabbing the enemy by the belt, and fighting to neutralize American firepower. The confrontation at Ia Drang thus became a life-and-death test between overwhelming firepower on one side and determined will, combined with flexible tactics in rugged jungle terrain on the other. At dawn on the 14th of November, 1965, after hours of preparatory fire, B-52 bombing, artillery, and armed helicopters were used to clear the way for the landing operation in the Ia Drang Valley. At approximately 10:48 a.m., the first Huey helicopters began descending onto Landing Zone X-Ray. Colonel Hal Moore, commander of the U.S. 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, personally directed the opening air assault. However, his lift capacity was limited, with only 16 Hueys available, forcing the troops to be inserted in small waves, each sortie carrying only about 80 to 90 soldiers. During the first hour, only around 90 U.S. troops were able to reach the landing zone. As soon as they touched down, they immediately established a temporary defensive perimeter, observing the surrounding terrain while waiting for the helicopters to return with subsequent lifts. The atmosphere at that moment was unusually quiet. There was no gunfire, no sign of enemy presence, only dense jungle and the slopes of the surrounding hills. That calm did not last long. Just minutes later, the first shots suddenly rang out, tearing through the forest. Company B of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, as it moved obliquely toward the northwest of the landing zone, made contact with the forward elements of the North Vietnamese 66th Regiment under the command of Colonel Nguyen Huan. A firefight erupted immediately. Lieutenant Geo Geoghegan led his platoon in an assault, quickly seizing control of an enemy firing position. But almost at once, from the surrounding hillsides, multiple North Vietnamese units emerged simultaneously, striking the American formation from both flanks and the rear, rapidly complicating the situation. As the fighting intensified, a U.S. platoon led by Lieutenant Henry Herrick became separated from the main force while pursuing a withdrawing enemy element. The unit advanced farther than intended and entered unfavorable terrain. Shortly after occupying a small knoll, Herrick's platoon was surrounded from multiple directions. Within the first 20 minutes of combat, the unit suffered heavy casualties. Lieutenant Herrick himself was killed, but not before he managed to radio back to battalion headquarters, reporting that his platoon had been cut off and urgently needed reinforcement. The remaining soldiers struggled to hold their ground and organize a defense under extremely difficult conditions. This isolated unit would later become known as the Lost Platoon of the Ia Drang Battle. Meanwhile, at the X-ray landing zone, North Vietnamese forces continued to press in. Increasing numbers of troops moved down from the slopes of the Chu Prong Massif toward the landing area, gradually placing the U.S. 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, under pressure from multiple directions. American strength amounted to only a few hundred men, while the opposing force was significantly larger. To the northwest, Company C came under heavy pressure from the opening moments. To the south, Company A was split apart and suffered severe losses as enemy assaults closed in rapidly. The dense jungle terrain constantly reduced the distance between the two sides, at times leaving opposing combat groups only a few dozen meters apart. This made the use of supporting fire from a distance especially difficult due to the high risk of striking friendly forces. Facing an increasingly critical situation, the U.S. command was forced to transmit an emergency signal under the codename Broken Arrow. This was a call for all available close air support aircraft operating in South Vietnam to rush in and rescue an overwhelmed unit. Almost immediately, attack aircraft and artillery from surrounding bases began pouring intense fire onto the outer perimeter of Landing Zone X-ray. 105mm artillery fired at extremely close range to the defensive lines to halt enemy assaults. Aircraft continuously delivered rockets, high explosive bombs, and napalm, forming a ring of firepower around the battlefield. Amid the thick smoke and flames, unintended incidents occurred when some bomb strikes fell too close to friendly defensive positions. Even so, by the end of November 14, Landing Zone X-ray remained under U.S. control. It was clear, however, that the battle at Ia Drang had only just begun. Throughout the night of November 14 into the early hours of November 15, fighting at Landing Zone X-ray continued with extreme intensity. North Vietnamese forces launched repeated assaults against the U.S. defensive perimeter, placing American troops under severe pressure and making counterattacks difficult. In the deep darkness, the distance between the two sides shrank rapidly, and many encounters took place at very close range. Both sides relied mainly on grenades, submachine guns, and hand-to-hand combat in chaotic conditions. At times, North Vietnamese elements penetrated right up to the edge of the defensive positions, forcing U.S. soldiers to fight within their own perimeter. On the American side, illumination flares were fired continuously to light up the area around the landing zone. 105mm artillery also delivered sustained fire throughout the night to block enemy approaches. The thunder of artillery was almost constant, creating a ring of fire around X-ray. By first light on November 15, Hal Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry had held out through its first day and night of trial by fire. Both sides suffered heavy losses, and the battlefield was strewn with the scars of bombardment and bodies lying amid shattered trees. That morning, U.S. forces at X-ray received reinforcements. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, was airlifted in by helicopter to join Moore's force, raising the total strength at the landing zone to nearly 900 men. With these additional troops, by midday on November 15, U.S. forces began to mount counterattacks, while North Vietnamese units shifted into a more deliberate defensive posture. Failing to achieve their objective of decisively destroying the U.S. force on the first day, North Vietnamese commanders began to adjust their deployment. They gradually pulled their units back out of the range of the enemy's heavy firepower, limited large-scale engagements during daylight hours, and waited for more favorable conditions. By November 16, only sporadic small arms exchanges were taking place around X-Ray. At around 11 a.m., when B-52 strikes began to fall along the slopes of the Chu Prung Massif, North Vietnamese forces had already withdrawn from the landing zone area. In this sense, the battle at X-Ray essentially ended after 3 days of fierce fighting, from November 14 to the 16th of November, 1965. The U.S. side declared that it had held the landing zone and regarded the engagement as an important tactical victory in the early phase of the war. However, the cost was substantial. At X-Ray alone, U.S. forces suffered 79 killed and 121 wounded. Even so, the opening phase of the Ia Drang battle clearly delivered a powerful shock to both sides. After the situation temporarily stabilized, U.S. Brigade Commander Thomas Brown decided to withdraw Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, by helicopter on November 16, ordered to preserve the force, while leaving the X-Ray area to be controlled by other units. By the afternoon of November 16, the situation at Landing Zone X-Ray had temporarily calmed. The area was then held only by the U.S. 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, along with several supporting artillery units positioned to the rear. After days of fighting that failed to produce the intended results, the U.S. Operational Command ordered its units to begin withdrawing from the Ia Drang Valley the following morning. However, instead of continuing to use helicopters to extract troops, as had been done earlier with Hal Moore's battalion, U.S. commanders made a different decision. They chose to move overland to 2 predetermined landing zones and then await helicopter pickup. Under the plan, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, would march toward Landing Zone Columbus to the north, while the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade, would move toward Landing Zone Albany to the northwest, deeper inside the valley. This decision to move on foot would later be regarded as highly risky. At the time, U.S. forces were unaware that North Vietnamese units were still closely monitoring their movements around the Albany area. After the fighting at X-Ray, American commanders assumed that the enemy had withdrawn from the region, leading to a relatively complacent march. The formation of nearly 400 soldiers stretched over more than 500 meters through open woodland. Without a tightly organized combat formation, and without sufficient long-range reconnaissance elements to provide effective security. This lack of vigilance inadvertently created a favorable opportunity for North Vietnamese forces to prepare a new ambush, and what followed would prove even more brutal than the days of fighting at X-Ray. At midday, on the 17th of November, 1965, the U.S. 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, began its march toward Landing Zone Albany, according to the established plan. The column moved along a narrow trail through open woodland, squads following one another in a long file beneath the forest canopy. At this point, the surrounding area appeared relatively quiet, with no clear signs of active fighting. Around noon, the lead elements spotted several figures briefly appearing along the edge of the forest. They immediately opened fire and gave chase. The opposing group, however, withdrew quickly. When the American column halted for a midday rest at a grassy clearing near the junction of 2 dry stream beds, North Vietnamese forces had already maneuvered into position along both flanks without being detected. At that moment, the 8th Battalion of the North Vietnamese 66th Regiment had occupied favorable positions around the Albany area. As the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry moved deeper into the assembly zone, fire suddenly erupted from the northern tree line. At approximately 12:15 p.m., machine guns and small arms opened up simultaneously at close range against the American column. At the same time, another element struck from the southern flank, cutting the marching formation into multiple segments. Caught by surprise, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was thrown into disorder for a short time. Several forward elements suffered heavy losses in the opening minutes. Many soldiers attempted to disperse to avoid the intense fire, while other groups tried to hold their ground and organize immediate resistance. During the fighting, a number of officers and platoon-level leaders were hit, complicating efforts to maintain command and communications. Shortly afterward, forces from the North Vietnamese 33rd Regiment also entered the area, further expanding the scope of the engagement. The distance between the two sides closed rapidly, making it difficult for U.S. long-range fire support to be brought to bear effectively. Artillery and air support faced serious challenges in identifying targets, as the opposing forces were intermingled and visibility was restricted by jungle terrain and smoke. Aircraft could operate only in a limited capacity, mainly over areas farther from the main ground fighting. On the ground, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was fragmented into numerous small groups. Some found relatively favorable positions from which to establish temporary defenses, while others were scattered deeper into the forest. Fighting continued at high intensity for several hours, and the majority of the battalion's casualties were incurred during the early phase of the ambush, before the unit could deploy into a coherent combat formation. It was not until mid-afternoon on November 17, around 3 p.m., that the U.S. command, recognizing that a battalion had been caught in an ambush and was facing the risk of annihilation, ordered the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry stationed at Landing Zone Columbus to move back to provide relief. This unit had to advance while fighting, gradually forcing its way toward the Albany area to reach and relieve the scattered elements of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, that were still holding out. As evening approached, the intensity of the fighting began to subside. By around 8 p.m. the same day, U.S. forces organized the withdrawal of the surviving troops from the Albany ambush area. The retreat was carried out under difficult conditions, as the unit had suffered heavy losses and had been scattered for many hours of combat. After the battle, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was almost no longer capable of effective combat operations. Out of nearly 400 soldiers at the outset, fewer than 1/3 remained able to continue their mission. According to official figures, 155 U.S. soldiers were killed and 124 wounded in the Albany battle, marking the highest single-day casualty toll suffered by the U.S. Army in Vietnam up to that point. Company C of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was hit especially hard, with most of its personnel put out of action. The Albany area became a devastated battlefield after the fighting. Across the valley, the bodies of soldiers from both sides lay scattered among trees, shattered by bombs and gunfire. Many of the bodies were badly damaged by the effects of heavy firepower and close-range combat. When North Vietnamese cadres inspected the battlefield after the engagement, they recorded the ferocity of the fighting based on what remained on the ground. These observations underscored the scale of the casualties and the brutal nature of the Albany ambush, one of the most intense moments of the Ia Drang campaign. On the morning of the 18th of November, 1965, U.S. forces began clearing the battlefield in the Albany area following the previous day's ambush. Huey helicopters were continuously dispatched to evacuate the wounded from the valley and to transport the bodies of fallen soldiers back to base. Medical evacuation and recovery operations were conducted urgently, amid a landscape still marked by the aftermath of fierce combat. Later that day, General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, along with General Cao Von Vien, arrived in Pleiku to inspect the Ia Drang campaign. There, they met Colonel Hal Moore and the surviving soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, before flying over the X-ray and Albany landing zones to observe the terrain after the battle. That afternoon, General Westmoreland held a press conference and stated that the Ia Drang battle represented an important outcome, marking the first time U.S. forces had directly engaged North Vietnamese main force units in a large-scale battle. In his remarks to the press, he did not address the Albany ambush in detail, instead describing it as an unexpected encounter with losses that were under control. This portrayal prompted mixed reactions among journalists, including those who had personally witnessed the extent of the destruction and casualties at Albany. Afterward, the U.S. military moved to control the flow of information released to the public. In the press, reports on Ia Drang largely emphasized assessments that U.S. forces had achieved favorable results in the valley, while specific details regarding losses were not fully disclosed. From a strategic perspective, the Battle of Ia Drang was regarded as a significant milestone for both sides. The engagement clarified the strengths and limitations of each side's approach to warfare, thereby influencing how forces would be deployed in subsequent phases of the conflict. After Ia Drang, the U.S. Army continued to rely on its advantages in mobility and firepower, while North Vietnamese forces placed greater emphasis on closing the distance in combat and exploiting terrain to limit the effectiveness of enemy firepower. Overall, the Battle of Ia Drang highlighted the substantial risks involved in deploying forces within a complex combat environment. Even though immediate objectives were achieved, both sides were compelled to adjust their tactics after the battle, and the Ia Drang Valley became the starting point of a longer and more brutal phase of fighting in the years that followed.